take over until Dennis comes. Um, are you back, Dennis?
Yeah, go ahead. Let's practice.
Okay. I don't want to take over. Go ahead. So I was
Right,
going to say that what we did last week, but you can go ahead now that you aren't frozen
right.
again.
And Cole, I'm excited because this is the first edition of the Liberia History Channel for 2024. Happy New
Yes,
Year to our viewers. Happy New Year. And it is no coincidence but that we are discussing the history of our culture for the for 2024 as the first episode. I'm excited.
I am too. This
Last
is
week we did part one, the history of our culture. There's this whole idea. Oh, what's your culture? What's the Liberian culture? And culture. What is culture? So we are going deep into our Liberian culture, how it started, the things we are doing today. Why are we doing them? Where does it
right.
come from? And what are the things that are? And really, the one I enjoy is there are a lot of things that unite us more than even what divides us, right? There are a lot of things that
Absolutely.
we do in common, whether you are Mandingo, whether you are Kru, whether you are Sapo or Ma, Dan. I mean, it's just all the same. So we are connecting the dots, and I'm excited. Carl, Happy New Year.
Yes. So a lot of us talk about last time we talked a lot about the indigenous Liberian heritage people of the various ethnic groups, what their contributions were culturally to the whole. So some of the cultural similarities, the intermarriage, the conquest of one another, the migration, integration of other ethnic groups, and kind of their history. So today is part two, and we're leaving from there. We're going to talk about people who repatriated to Liberia and what kinds of cultural impact they had on everyone else. So, can you think of some things off the top of your head that might be some interesting cultural impacts that would have been brought by repatriated people to Liberia in the 19th century?
I think the way we speak, right? Some of the things, because even now I have some friends from the Caribbean, and I'm wondering. I mean, why do we have sometimes call some things in common
Yeah,
or do some? Yeah. So I believe some of the things that we say could be influenced by our brothers and sisters from who were repatriated.
yes, absolutely. Lot of things. The words we use for different foods, our accent. And we're going to get into that next week. This week, we're going to focus more on recaptured Africans and the people that came from the Congo Basin. But yes, the sometimes some of the ways we cook our food and prepare our food are influenced by repatriated Africans. We don't think about that. We think everything was just Liberian. Well, it is just Liberian, but what is Liberian? It's interesting because when you study food, African Americans and Caribbean people took West African food with them to the New World, and they adapted and also absorbed cooking habits of Europeans, that the descendants of Europeans, and created a different type of cuisine. So they took things with them from Africa, went to the Americas and the Caribbean, adapted indigenous culture and European culture, mixed all of that together, and then when they were repatriated back to Liberia, they returned the culture a little bit different. And we look
Mm.
at things like collard greens and those things. We really have to understand that even though it's a transplant, it's also a retransplant. So you take it away, you bring it back different. Just like the people, the food also did
Right.
that transition. So Liberian food is excellent for a reason. It has so much influence from around the world, so much global impact on our cuisine. And our cuisine is as diverse and interesting as our people.
Mm. And Carl, talking about the food, my brother just returned from Liberia, and what he was
Oh,
talking about, because and it's interesting, right? Because we come and bring the Liberian food here, but after being here for a while, there's a little modification. So when he went back, he complained that the meat over there was hard. He said, he said yes,
well, there you go.
it's,
So yeah, there's just that little modification.
exactly.
When I was growing up as a child in Wisconsin and Minnesota, when I was growing up, I thought that Liberians ate fried spinach because we didn't have potato greens. I didn't realize that they were using spinach as a substitute. for
Mhm.
potato greens. So when I went to Liberia in 2008, when I was working for the UN, I went to Liberia. They said, "What would you, they're so polite. Oh, madam, what would you like to eat?" And I said, "Spinach." And they were like, "What?" Everybody's just looking in my face like, "What is spinach?" And I really thought that was a Liberian food. And I said, "You don't know fried spinach?" They were like, you know. And then somebody nudged me and said, "Ask for potato greens," because, I really thought that spinach was a thing in Liberia and it isn't. So those are some of the little things. We ended up frying spinach and stuff because we didn't have the potato greens.
Hmm.
So I'm reporting myself. But
Yes. So today we're going to talk about part two of the history of our culture.
yes.
Call just a refresher for people watching us for the first time on this particular topic. What is culture? What is when we say our culture? What are we talking about?
So we summarize this basically meaning that culture is anything that we make and do. Culture is anything we create. It refers to, the characteristics, beliefs, customs, practices, values, behaviors of a group of people. And it's not stagnant, it changes, right? It changes with influence. And also, when things fall out of favor, when things are no longer useful, you throw those cultural practices away. Not necessarily throw them away, but they go out of favor. You stop doing certain things if you don't need to, or if you find a better way to do something. And then there's other aspects of culture that are really not useful, but they're tradition. So we just do them because it's tradition, not because it really has any practical use anymore. Maybe it's some beautiful custom that we still continue to do, even though it's lost its origin and its meaning. It's just something that people continue. And we gave many examples of that in the West and also in our context in Liberia as well.
Hmm. Where does culture come from?
It comes from human creation, human creativity, and the need to adapt to human environment and to adapt to interacting with other humans and communication.
And how does it pass from one generation to the other?
So culture is not something you're born with. It's something that you learn. It's learned behavior and it's taught to you by your parents, your community, and your greater society. So if you live in a very large nation, your cultural competence, your cultural uh, views are going to be much broader, much more complex. If you live in a smaller band or a smaller, community, your culture is going to be less open and subject to change in the same rapid way. So people that live in larger, diverse groups tend to change faster, adapt faster, and have more complexities with their culture. And people that live in smaller, more isolated groups tend to have a slower process of change. So one of the things with culture is that it changes more when it has external influences more rapidly, which should be obvious.
I like that external influence. So most of the time, what we hear, "Oh, stop that! It's not our culture." Sometimes
Right.
there's certain things coming, and even in politics, they say, "No, we can't do this. It's not part of our culture." What does that mean?
Hmm. It depends on what exactly they're talking about, what the context.
Okay.
They might mean tradition. They might mean religion. They might mean, you're doing something offensive and you're just being rude, and this is not part of our ethical standards of conduct. So it depends on the context. People use those phrases in all of those contexts.
We sometimes I don't know because it's more saying outside, but sometimes when we say culture, people are quickly to think about dress code. So when they say, okay,
Yes,
we're going to have
what
a
you
court.
what you wear is definitely a reflection of culture as well. That's correct. So, culture. If you look at our country cloth, if you look at our Vi shirts, our gowns, our traditional attire, those all have cultural influences. What I'm wearing now is a print reflecting of the mud cloth from our region. This
Thank
is
you.
culture. So culture is vast. It's
Mhm.
complicated.
Yes, because there
It
can
can
be
be
an
beautiful
infusion,
and it
right?
can be ugly.
And when like those of us who went away, I live in Guinea, I live in Ivory Coast, Ghana, Nigeria. So when I go
Hmm.
back to Liberia, I'm picking up some things, and then when I go back, I'm going to infuse them in there, right?
Hmm.
So things just keep changing and things just keep moving.
Yeah,
But sometimes we hold on to it and say, no, 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 we can't change. But we find ourselves changing some things.
of course.
Today, we're going to be looking at part two of this very important topic, the history of our culture, examining the unique historical experiences that make us, that make us Liberians.
Yes.
I am excited. I don't know why I love this so much. So, Cole, where do we begin?
So you can go ahead. Look, I want to first talk about the picture. I went out of my way to get to very interesting. So this is a beaded necklace from my home, my ancestral home, from where my parents and grandparents and their grandparents and great great grandparents and so on come from, which is Ga, in Nimba near Ganta there, and it is a beaded necklace that Dr. Harding took from whoever he took it from, one of my ancestors most likely, and took this, and it's in a museum here in Massachusetts right now. But this was taken out of Liberia in the year 1933. But it's much older than that. When Dr. Harding took it, he said it was from the 19th century. So maybe from the late 1800s or mid 1800s. So he took it as an artifact because it was said to have been very old. Whether they gave it to him or he took it is beyond me.
Yeah.
So we're gonna not talk about this beaded necklace today. We're really gonna just talk about, the influence of external things. I just wanted to put a pretty picture there, and there it is. So the impact
So,
of Caribbean. Sorry, go ahead, Dennis.
so the impact of Caribbean African American immigrants on the accent and culture of Liberia can be traced back to the settlement of free slaves in the country during the 19th century. These immigrants, often referred to as Americo-Liberians, underline that word, we'll talk about that a little bit, played a significant role in shaping Liberia's culture and language.
Yes. So we're talking about distinct groups of people here. We're talking about people that came from North America, from the United States. Some of them were born free. We've talked about this in so much detail. Some of them were the earliest group were mostly born free. And the earliest group to go to Liberia on the first two ships, the Elizabeth and the Brignalis and Brig Strong, the first three ships. The Elizabeth and the Brignalis went to what is now Sierra Leone. They went to Cherbourg Island initially. And the Elizabeth and the Brig Nautilus both had a large group of recaptured Africans, especially the Elizabeth. And the African Americans on the Elizabeth were mostly educators. They were going as teachers, as people to educate and set up a home and school for a place for recaptured Africans who were illegally taken into the slave trade after the transatlantic slave trade had been abolished. They were going to set up a home for them. So the first two ships, the African Americans that were on board were very educated. You had, basically missionaries, Black missionaries, and recaptured Africans. The Brig Strong was the first to actually land in what is now like modern Liberia, and the other two ships, some of the inhabitants of the Elizabeth remained in Sierra Leone. Some of them went to Liberia in 1822. So a lot of those that went were recaptured Africans who had been in the United States, had been baptized, and also had been, taught to speak English and read. However, because they were not born in America, some of them had scarification on their faces and indications that they were from certain parts of West Africa. So this is very important. So we have a mixture here of recaptured Africans and highly educated African Americans. People like Lot Carey, who came and who was on the Nautilus. You have Elijah Johnson, who fought in the War of 1812. Hillary Teague, who was a brilliant orator, a reverend. You had some of the best and the brightest. In fact, many of those who led to establishing the Republic of Liberia were on those first three vessels. My one of my very favorite presidents, which is Stephen Allen Benson, was on the big Brig Strong and went to Liberia when he was 6 years old. So this is a mixture of people. They're coming in with a very strong Protestant faith. They're Christians. Their mission is to spread the word of God and to win souls for Christ and to baptize. And in their minds, when you become a Christian, you are now liberated from ignorance as well. So part of the process of education for them, their goal was to Christianize their African brethren, including the recaptured Africans who were among them. So any questions? You said you underlined the Americo-Liberian word.
Right. So
Yes.
America, let's talk about that a little bit. So let me read again. These immigrants, often referred to as Americo-Liberians, played a significant role in shaping Liberia's culture and language.
Yes.
Where does that come from, Americo-Liberians? Because
So
as I understand, they never called themselves that for a long time.
no, they called themselves immigrants to Liberia, and when they created the republic, they simply called themselves Liberians. Hillary Teague used to refer to his friends as citizen this and citizen that because they didn't have citizenship when they left the United States. So they would say, Citizen Teague, oh, Citizen Johnson, how are you? It was like a title of high respect at that period in history. So no, they didn't call themselves Americo-Liberians. They just called themselves Liberians. And Tubman, by the time Tubman was president, over 100, about 100 years later, Tubman was infuriated at people using this phrase Americo-Liberian, though Tubman's mother was born in Georgia. And then his father's father was born in Georgia, though he was, he was from Georgia. His people were from Georgia. He was very, closely, he was just one generation on his mother's side removed from the United States. He still didn't like, President Tubman still did not like the term. And he said, we're just Liberians. And the reason is it wasn't their own invention. This is something that was invented by anthropologists from outside and just used as a way to describe the Americanized Liberians or the descendants of America in Liberia.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I know you spoke about the shift already. Between 1822 and 1861, over 25,000 African Americans, recaptured Africans, and African Caribbeans repatriated to Liberia.
Yeah. So, you're talking about 25,000 human beings. This is a lot. And this 25,000 people, you have among them recaptured Africans, Afro-Caribbeans. This is, between, I would push that number to really 1865, because the 1865 is when you had that huge influx of people from the Caribbean, particularly Barbados. Many teachers and educators and things came from Barbados at that time. So it's a huge influx of people. So forget about the 1861. I would put 1865. Actually, I would take it up to about 1870. And if you take it to 1870, you're looking more at maybe about 30,000 people, as opposed to 25,000. So that's a lot of people being repatriated, descendants of former slaves, freed, not free, but freed slaves, meaning people who have been liberated from slavery. And the truth is, initially, the African Americans, the descendants of the generational descendants of enslaved people in America who were born free, were the ones who were sent. It is much later on that freed or liberated slaves are then returned. The other thing that happens is that you have the recaptured Africans. And a lot of times they were born free, but taken into bondage, not a lot of times, all the time, taken into bondage unlawfully, held in the United States in tribunal to make sure that they were unlawfully taken, and then they were sent back. So this is the mixture of people. And a lot of the ones that came from Barbados and other Caribbean islands were highly educated. Most of them were educators that came to teach, especially the wives of the Barclays. All of these women were teachers. So when you listen to Liberians talk, a lot of times, and we'll get into this next week, their accent is very Caribbean because a lot of the people who taught them to speak were from Barbados, or not to speak, but to speak English. So many of the recaptured Africans were taught English by African Americans and Bajans, the people from Barbados. And the Liberian accent is an influence of the Kru languages and some Mindi language, with mostly coastal Kru languages like the Bassa, the Klau, and all of those. And then you've got the influence of African American vernacular and Caribbean dialects as well.
Let's go over that again. You say our accent was influenced by.
So Kru vernacular, which means Bassa, Grebo, Crowd, right? You got Cloud, the Bassa, the Grebo. Those have a heavy influence. So that coastal vernacular, the coastal, syntax, meaning the way they arrange and order words. Now, in the Caribbean and in African American culture, you also have a West African syntax being used to speak English, but they have a little bit of Irish influence as well. So if you're in Barbados, you're Bajan, they kind of had a little bit of an Irish accent because they were interacting with a lot of immigrants from Ireland in the 1800s. So now you have this Irish English African combination coming from the Caribbean. You've got, the African Americans coming also with this influence. And they're bringing this into a melting pot. So the Liberian accent is unlike any other on the continent or in the world, really. If you had to find the closest relationship to the Liberian accent, it would be in Barbados.
Yeah. And that's why there is no country that can duplicate the Liberian accent, no matter how they try.
No, not at all. So the closest thing to the now, when I say a Liberian accent, I do want to make sure I emphasize that we are really talking about Montserrado, because the vernacular in Maryland, in Sino, among repatriated people, among English-speaking indigenous people, was very different. It was much more African American influence and not as much Caribbean influence. So if you listen to Marylanders speak, they sounded more, and people in Sino speak, they sounded more Southern. You had a high number of people from Mississippi, Georgia, the Carolinas. So the accent is different. Monrovia English heavily influenced by the Caribbean. So everybody wanted to sound like Sir Arthur Barkley. I don't know. And then all these Caribbean women that were teaching in those places. And so if you're a young Bassa child, you go into school, who's teaching you how to speak English? A person from Barbados with a heavy Bajan accent. So then you start to pronounce words similar to your teachers.
Yeah.
Which is not the experience that people had in Maryland, Sino area at the time. Bassa was a little different as well. So we did have regional differences, and you have to remember we didn't have telecommunications in those days. So the accents people used to speak were very distinct at that point in history. Modern technology kind of, universalizes language a little bit more.
In the years just before the Civil War, during the most intensive phase of American slave trade suppression, the U.S. Navy seized roughly 2,500 enslaved Africans from illegal slave ships and brought them into temporary camps at Key West and Charleston, Savannah. These recaptives and recounts the relationship they built to survive the holds of slave ships, American detention camps, and ultimately a second transatlantic voyage to Liberia.
Yeah, so this is a description of a book actually called Recaptured Africans I have, but many of these people from America were sent, in fact, the recaptured Africans in America were sent to Liberia. Sierra Leone has a larger population of recaptured Africans that were taken directly from sea. But in Liberia, you have recaptured Africans who, most of whom were experiencing some type of tribunal because the process in the United States was it was criminal to bring kidnapped enslaved people into the U.S. territory. Slavery had not yet been abolished in the United States, but the importation of new slaves was illegal. So when people would bring a cargo load of human chattel into the United States, the captain and crew would be arrested by the American Navy. It was pre-Coast Guard, but basically the U.S. Navy would arrest you. They would take you most likely to either Savannah, Charleston, those main ports. They would seize the ship. They would put the African captives in a kind of like a holding place, keep them there, and they would try their captors. And if found guilty, those captors would often be imprisoned, and then the recaptured Africans would then be, now at this point, Liberia has been established, they would then be deported or removed to Liberia. And part of that process of anglicizing them, teaching them English, baptizing them would begin while they were while this tribunal was going on to determine if in fact they were unlawfully obtained. So by the time they get to Liberia, they now have Christian names. By the time they get to Liberia, they're now speaking English, but they're still very, very different from the African Americans. They have heavy accents because you're talking about just 1 or 2 years. So the people who established New Georgia, for example, they had only been in Georgia for 3 years. And when they went back, they were still very, very West African. Though they could now speak English, though they could now, they now were worshiping Christ, they were Christians. And this was not an option. You want to eat, you want to live, you're going to have to bow to the cross. You're going to have to accept Jesus into your life. This was not an option. And if you were wearing any kind of charms or any kind of beads from your culture, that had to be removed because those things were told to them to not be of God.
Yeah. Carl, I don't know if you want to answer some questions now as we go along or at the end.
I can. I mean, as long as it's related to what we're discussing, that's
right.
fine.
So Morris P. Krumah said they can't be called repatriated Africans either because the people who returned were disconnected from their roots. Morris, I don't know what. But even further, the slaves entirely or exclusively in Africa. A Caribbean could have been returned to Africa. The assumption that the folks who returned were all Africans is flawed.
I'm not understanding how he's thinking they're not Africans. I don't even understand that question. I mean, what were they? You can't. I mean, I'm just really shocked about that. That's a bizarre thing. You have a person like Stephen Allen Benson, whose parents were born in Africa, goes to Liberia at 6 years old. You want to tell me Benson wasn't African? You have same thing with Daniel Bashir Warner. You also have people who were removed from the continent of Africa, and you're saying they're not being repatriated to the continent of Africa. That's very strange.
Right. So Morris, you can clarify if you say they were not Africans, what do you mean? You mean they were not? They were white people?
Let's move on. Let's move on. That was bizarre. He should clarify it because that doesn't really
maybe it's not clear.
Let's continue.
Maybe it's not clear. That's why. So Morris, please clarify.
So this is a image of one of the recaptured Africans on a ship called the Antelope, which was held in tribunal in New Georgia. So I mean this is a child. So it's just to show you that during the illegal transatlantic slave trade, they were taking children, small children, into slavery. And we have an episode here where we talk about some of the enslaved people that were taken from Trade Town in Bassa, and they were rescued by the British Navy and resettled in Sierra Leone, and they had their names, a lot, and their ages and their heights. and a lot of them were little children. And those slaves were taken from Trade Town in Bassa, so they would have been ethnically Liberian, but they are now, their descendants are now Sierra Leonean. I wanted to point out that a lot of those who were held in tribunal were kids and resettled to New Georgia. And they were absolutely African. Arthur Barkley was from Dahomey. He was a descendant of the Dahomey Empire. So these are not what do you call it? These are not Hawaiian natives. These are native Africans being repatriated to the continent of their origin. So the antelope ordeal. This is another published sketch of recaptured Africans on the antelope on the ship. These are the people who later on went to go establish the settlement of New Georgia. And this occurred during the administrations of James Monroe and John Quincy Adams was the one during his, not the one, but during his administration, John Quincy Adams' administration, they were then sent to Liberia. It was determined that they were unlawfully taken from what is now modern day Nigeria.
And this is one of the beauty of Liberia, right? People that were taken from modern day Nigeria, now they're being sent back, and they are in modern day Liberia, and they are in New Georgia.
Yeah. So they're bringing with them a different type of West African culture. They're bringing with them a different type of West African culture. They're not bringing culture with them that the people on the Grain Coast are familiar with. Although there's similarities and there are things that they have in common, there are things that they do not have in common as well. And in some cases, the recaptured Africans were more comfortable deserting the settlement and retreating and living among the Dey or other groups because they were more comfortable there than they were living in the settlement, the pre-Republic settlement.
Most of the recaptured Africans who were repatriated to Liberia came from the Congo Rainforest region, Cameroon, yes, Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, and Nigeria and Benin.
Yes.
And this is where we get our Congo people name from.
Yeah, so this is important. When people think Congo, they're thinking we're talking about the modern country of Congo. We're really talking about the Congo Rainforest region. The Congo Rainforest region, which is Benin, Nigeria, and all of these countries, Gabon, and of course, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And some of the recaptured Africans are coming from deep within the rainforest. They've been marched to the coast. They've been raided. They've been captured. They've been forced into unlawful slavery. They've been taken by force and forcibly transplanted to the United States. They have been sitting in a tribunal or waiting for the trial of their captors to determine whether or not they should be returned. Now, I want to point something out. I say this many, many times on this platform. The reason they were returning recaptured Africans to Liberia and Sierra Leone and not trying to take them back to where they came from, even if they knew where they came from, is because it wasn't safe. The conditions that led to their enslavement in the first place were still prevalent. So there's taking a person back to a place where they were captured and tormented, had their towns burned, and probably had the populations decimated by some enemy force is basically akin to sending them into a situation where they either be resold or be killed. So Liberia and Sierra Leone were safe havens, safe zones for them to be able to live and thrive. So they are being repatriated to the continent of Africa because the rest of the continent, especially the places of origin, were in chaos. This also happened with people who were liberated from slavery within the Liberian territory. Simultaneously, while Liberia was being established and all of the other settlements along the coast, there were still slave raids occurring within the territory, in the region. It was Joseph Jenkins Roberts and Governor Buchanan that started the fight to cancel slavery on the Grain Coast, snuffing out Salinas, Trade Town, slavery on the base of the Cavala River, at Little Bassa, at Cape Mount. Grand Cape Mount was one of the what is now Robertsport, was one of the, the last slave depots to be toppled. When they topple these places and they decimate all of the barracoons and break them down and burn them so they can prevent human beings from being sold, those who were brought to the coast from usually from up in the northern regions, in the Golo Forest, up the St. John River, and all these places, those people would be liberated but not returned to where they came from because they usually did not have homes to go back to. So what became of them? They were then incorporated into the Liberian Republic. So those people are usually not called recaptured Africans by scholars, but that's essentially what they were. Because if you have the only difference between those populations and the recaptured Africans is that those populations were not rescued from ships, they were rescued from land, situated containment centers or barracoons is what they're called, basically prisons where they're held until the ships come to shore and they can be sold. That number of people is probably greater than 10,000 over the time period of the establishment of Liberia. And again, most of them would have been baptized and become more westernized and part of the Western culture. Not all of them. Some of them retreated and refused to incorporate themselves, and others were happy to incorporate themselves because of the trauma they had been through. This process of obtaining human beings for slavery was not a peaceful exchange. It was often done through war and conquest, very violent, brutal situations where entire towns would be burned. Remnants of this activity are still prevalent in the rainforest to this day. You can still see remnants of charred towns all these years later. So this is, you can go ahead and read, and I'll go from there.
It's the same thing, just the picture different.
Oh, okay. Oh, that was an error. So this is supposed to be talking about the Leopard Society. I'll just tell you what the point is. So this picture is from Cameroon, which is in the Congo Basin. And you have, this is a picture from the 1920s. So this is not from the time period, but I just wanted to show that you still have these leopard hunters. I mean, what a beautiful animal. You've got these leopard hunters, these leopard killers, and there's this concept that the British presented that there is something called a leopard society, which is supposed to be some kind of cult where the people supposedly, according to these British testimonies, somehow these leopard men can spiritually transform themselves into leopard, and they accuse them of all kinds of ritualistic killings and horrible things. Well, this is something that's prevalent in the Congo rainforest region. I want you to listen to me carefully. Talk about transplanting people and populations. You transplant cultures and practices. The leopard society exists in the Congo rainforest basin. It does not exist in Togo. It does not exist in Ghana. It does not exist in Cote d'Ivoire. It does not exist in Guinea. It exists in Liberia and Sierra Leone. It does not exist in Guinea-Bissau. It does not exist in Senegambia region. Doesn't exist in Senegal. Doesn't exist in Gambia. Doesn't exist in Mali. Everything in this part of the region of Liberia, it is not there. So a culture skips over, supposedly, Togo, it skips over Ivory Coast, it skips over Ghana, it skips, I mean, and then you see it in Liberia and you see it in Sierra Leone, not in Guinea. Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone are so culturally similar. How is that possible? The answer is the populations from the Congo rainforest in great numbers were transplanted to Sierra Leone and Liberia. And so, to Morris, to your point in saying that these people were not Africans, their cultural practices that they took from Nigeria and Cameroon and Benin followed them to Liberia and Sierra Leone. Clearly, they're African. And Africans do African things. They have African memories. They have African understandings. Even when you're cut off from your land, culture prevails. It's passed down generation upon generation. You still have Yoruba religion alive and well in places like Brazil, Bahia, right? And you have all of these traditions passed down. So we'll go to the next one.
Right. And the leper society, that's the Haman business. That what you mean?
Well, I don't know what the high man business is. I just described what the leper society is. I don't know what
No,
high
you
man
said
means.
the leper society is skipped over all these countries and is in Sierra Leone and Liberia.
Yes.
And what is that leper society in Liberia?
Well, they claim they had the leper society in Liberia.
Hmm.
And last week we talked about people who had been imprisoned in Liberia and accused of being members of the leper society that were from indigenous Liberian groups. And I said last week that that's not really possible at that point in history because it is not an indigenous Liberian culture. So there's a lot of politics around it. British societies would use a false accusation of people being leopard men as an excuse to exterminate them. So that happened all over the British colonies. But I wanted to point out that they didn't do it in Ghana, which is British, right? And so or Gambia, the focus was Liberia and Sierra Leone, and the explanation for this is the transplanted population, the great number of transplanted population of the population. Yes.
Reports that the Anyoto sometimes imitated leper attacks and the existence of their costumes played on the European imagination. Reports often mention the Anyoto killing innocent victims without any apparent reason. The cannibalistic aspect also receives a great deal of attention in the reports, even if it does not generally seem correct.
Yeah. So a lot of this is clogged with like a lot of hate. You know, it's basically dehumanizing, disrespectful. It's 19th century. They like to make everything. This is the age of Tarzan, the wild man, and all this kind of stuff. So they kind of over exaggerated, I believe, a lot of this stuff, and probably didn't properly understand this culture, this leopard, what they called a cult. But it was something that was transcending linguistic boundaries in the Congo rainforest basin. So you had people who were of Yoruba descent and people who were, from as far away as Cameroon and Angola, all belonging to this kind of brotherhood of leopard men. And then this now gets transplanted to Liberia. And we can come back to the questions and stuff, Dennis, at the end. It's better to not interrupt the flow.
Mhm.
So one of the reasons I believe that they were falsely accusing them, I mean, I think they knew that these men in the interior, especially when President Howard moved into the North and Central Territory, one of the reasons that they did not, or they assumed that our people were leopard men, is because we also hunted leopards. We also hunted leopards and revered leopard skins and all these kinds of things. That could be the reason. But I honestly believe it was a false accusation. Our people are Poro and Sende in our region: Guinea, Liberia, Sierra Leone. Poro and Sende at this point. We don't know about leopard society business. That is something. And in fact, when you listen to some of the indigenous people that will say, oh, this thing here was brought back by the American Liberians, because they don't understand that there's a group of people called Congos. And it wasn't actually, the people who were descendants of the actual African Americans. It was repatriated Africans who brought a different type of, I'm not going to call it a cult, a different type of belief system. Whether or not this leopard society was actually involved in killing, or if it was just a different type of belief system, a different type of brotherhood, and the leopard was just a symbol, and the Europeans exaggerated this to kind of dehumanize them and justify what they were going to do to them, I'm not sure. That's left for people who are going to study that culture. But I do know it is a sect, a belief system, a sort of brotherhood, probably not too much unlike what we do with our own Poro and Sende, except this one is tainted with this concept of extreme violence by British colonialists and British writers of the time period. Whether they're telling the truth or not, I don't know.
Yeah, because that's typical. Anything you don't understand, you try to describe it your own way, especially at that time, those writers, that's what they did.
Right. And they were describing it, they had an agenda. There's an interest, there's a reason they would want to engage in some form of dehumanization or sensationalize the topic. Made a good story. You get it published in the New York Times, the leopard men of West Africa. It was like, wild and interesting things. So these recaptured Africans are people born in Africa, transplanted, rescued from these vessels, and returned.
Now we have a photograph of a down king.
Yeah, so this leopard, that's what I was great. I brought this up. He's not related to the recaptured Africans, but I was showing his photo. This is King Tapi. That Tapi town is named after. His photo was taken around 1915. I wish it was more clear to see his face, but he seems very tall and lean and strong at the time in 1915. And it looks like they killed the leopard and laid it before him. Powerful stuff.
Yeah. No, leopard is a big kill. People, because there's a big celebration in the part of Liberia I come from when a leopard is killed. So this is huge.
Yeah.
Brave people do this. So it makes sense that they will lay the leopard at the feet of the king.
Yeah.
And not to digress, this is the man Tapeta is named after.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's Tapita.
Right. Because
and no, it's not Tape, and no, he's not Crew. This is a Damen.
Right.
So
Because I've heard
that rumor that it was a person of the Clau language family is not actually Tapi. It was a Damen.
Right. I've heard that. I heard that story too. That Tapeta is named after a crewman Tape.
Yeah. Because they pronounce it Tape, it sounds similar, but it's Tapi, and he's a Damen. There's no question about that. So I think what people do a lot of times is they make assumptions, and they just roll with it.
Yeah.
But no, this is not. His name was not Tape like the cloud name.
No, Carl, but I don't know if you realize that this is what you are saying. This is big deal.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, it's big deal because I've heard a story that Tape, Tapeta it was named after a crewman, and so that's why it's called a Tapeta. So now this is huge. I don't know how many people know because I was in Liberia. I went to school in Liberia, so anything I don't know, I know the average. When it comes to Liberian history, I know the average person doesn't know it because I was a damn good student.
No, his name he's not, he was dying. His name was Tapi.
So,
And what a lot of times people do is they just make assumptions,
but
and
is
it's
this
not
name,
it's not it's not a it's not a right thing to do. If you
is
make an
this
assumption, you could say, "Oh, his name's Tapi. I wonder if he was proud." Is a more honest statement than to say he was a proud man and they named him after this. That's not true. This
is
is
that, is
this
this a
man
common name in the Dan area, Tapi?
Tapi. Yeah, it is, and in fact, he was not only was he Don. Daniel Howard interacted with him, and clearly he was photographed. He interacted with people. He talked to people. He told his story. He was interviewed. He and King Wool, who was from the region around Ganta at the same time period. These are the allies of the Liberian government. They knew them. So there's no question about it. If you had been from somewhere else, they would have written it down. So you have to go off of first-hand accounts and not,
Yeah.
because something sounds like something else. And
Is,
the cultures in Liberia have a lot of names that sound similar, right? Dole, you got Dole in Kran, you got Dole in Dan, right? So there's a lot of names that sound similar, but Tapi and Tapa don't have the same roots and origin. It's just, it starts with the letter T and ends in a vowel sound. It's just,
yeah.
you know.
Thank you. And viewers, please take note. Tapeta, I mean, we,
And
and
it's not topic. It's not topic. Let's move on. Let's move
oh,
on.
this is Congo Town,
Yes, sir.
town house with inheritance.
So I want to point this out because it's very, very important. This is a photograph that was taken in the year 1926 in Congo Town by the Harvard expedition team. This is a a style of house that is not in Liberia. This is how they built these in the rainforest of the Congo Basin. And way 1926, they're still building houses of this style in Liberia. So Morris, they're Africans. And here they were. This is how homes were built in Congo Town. And there's also similar things that were going on in New Georgia when they got there. So the architectural styles that they were used to, they're supposed to build their homes. This is what they were doing until they started to culturally integrate with the mainstream Liberians. This is another this is another photograph of Congo Town. These are not Liberian style homes. These are clearly homes from the further south, and in that Congo Basin area, you can see some of these types of homes in Cameroon and places like that. This is not Liberian homes of our indigenous people look different.
Hmm.
They are different. So this is showing that there is that what I'm trying to say is they're clearly building homes from their tradition. Because again, they were born in Africa. Many of them only spent 2 to 3 years awaiting tribunal to be returned. If you leave Boparu, live in Boparu your whole life, you spend 2 years, even in New York City, even if you're left in isolation like they were in the tribe while awaiting, the tribunal, even if you live in an urban area in the United States where you're interacting with other people, you're not going to go home and forget how to do the things you did 2 years or 3 years ago. So these are the Congo people. These are the people of the Congo rainforest, the Congo rainforest region. These are the people we generically call Congo today.
Mm-hmm. So, so
Congo.
this kind of architecture was not in Liberia. They took it there.
Right. And if you've been to our villages, if you've seen what if you go back to the King Tapi, to Tapita,
Right.
you'll see that is not how our homes look. It's completely different. In the north, the Mendi people, the roofs are much taller.
Yeah.
The Vai, the Vey, all of these homes, you go Bopu, it's distinctly African, but it's not the same. The style of the roof, the entryway, it's completely different. You go to where the crew people are. This is not our culture. I mean, it influences our culture, right? Because you have an interaction,
Right.
but it in their culture becomes influence. But this is not. You won't see this exact style of roof and building among us.
Deep in the southeast, I don't think you even see this at all, even till
It's
this
it's
day.
not it's not our culture. It's an implanted, a transplanted African culture. And they have cultural tendencies that also influence us, the way they prepare certain kinds of food. So they do things differently from us. It's very interesting to look at, and you can see how we picked up things in Liberia and Sierra Leone that right in Guinea they didn't pick up. And sometimes we attribute those things to African American repatriates. It's really coming from what is now Nigeria, Cameroon,
Mm.
Benin.
And I know we talked about that before, like the recapture Africans. We tend to focus more on the ones we call American Liberians. I don't know, because we wanted to be connected to the United States, and that's why we downplay maybe the influence of people from other parts of Africa that influence our culture. Well, what do you think?
Say that again.
I said
The
in Liberia, we talk more of the American Liberians,
hmm
meaning people that came from the United States and went to Liberia.
hmm
And we think they influenced the culture more, but I said they were more repatriated and people from the Caribbeans, and they had an
well,
impact. But
they weren't.
we
So
tend
if
to
you if you add the indigenous people who were incorporated early on because they were displaced by wars and all kinds of issues. You've got, King Boosie's people. You've got King Peter Brumley's, the days that were incorporated before the Republic was established. You've got the people who were rescued from Trade Town, from Cape Mount, from all of these places. What did they tell? What did they tell King Mamuru? You are no longer king, and your slaves are now our citizens. You are no longer king, and your slaves are now our citizens. That's powerful. Those are indigenous people too. Those slaves that are now their citizens. And those slaves did not come from Congo. Those slaves did not come from Georgia and Mississippi and Virginia. Those slaves came from Bopuru. Those slaves came from Cape Mount. Those slaves came from Trade Town. Those enslaved African people were native to the area. And they said, you are no longer king, and your slaves are now our citizens. They were baptized and incorporated. And all of their descendants, along with the descendants of the recaptured Africans, are called Congo people.
okay.
Because anybody that was westernized and spoke English a certain way, and went to school and lived a certain way, went to church a certain way, was considered Congo, or that Congo person. Even the Basas who were westernized, oh, that Congo Basa person. It doesn't mean that they came from somewhere else. It means that they're culturally assimilated and westernized. Many of the people who we call Congo are from right there. They're Dave, they're Vai, they're Mandinka, who had converted early on to Christianity and become incorporated. If you read Wolu's report that he gave to the US government, If you read Wolo's report when he came out of Harvard that he gave to the US government about Liberia, he brilliantly explains this.
Yes, and my question was the focus is often on American Liberians instead of those people because
Mhm.
maybe I'm asking, is it because we really want to be more attached to America? Because I think the influence of these people was more.
I think it was, I don't know if it was more. I think they had an influence. I think the cultural supremacy exhibited by the people who were from America.
Okay.
They exhibit a sense of cultural arrogance and supremacy in the sense that they felt that their conduct and their behavior was ideal. How they dressed, how they worshiped God, right? Because the Congos were baptized and under their influence. So, what ends up happening, which we're going to talk about next week, is how the Caribbean people come and they don't really, necessarily fully identify with the African Americans. They're really aligned with the westernized Congos more. We're going to talk about that next week and how that influenced politics in Liberia.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is still Congo Town, but this one look more indigenous to the place.
Yeah. So you remember this is diversity, right? So you've got recaptured Africans from different areas. This is the same 1926, but this person is more westernized. This person's more, hey, I'm going to build my house like, it's going to look more like the houses I see the crewmen living in. Down there in Crewtown. I'm going to build my house the way I see these other people building their houses. So this is an adaptation. You can see the two people standing there. This is Congo
Yeah.
Town still. They're changing, small, small.
Yeah.
They're changing.
And these are their descendants.
Yeah, so the captions, which is hard to read, descendants of Congo slaves, it says. This is New Georgia. This picture is taken in New Georgia. And this picture is actually older than the other pictures. This picture is from around 1890, circa 1890, around 1890. You've got these two women, and they're clearly, they're from New Georgia. These people are probably born on Liberian soil or went to Liberia as babies. I'm pretty sure they were born on Liberia soil. They don't look very old. And look at their clothes. Very Protestant.
Yeah.
Could be Lutheran, could be Baptist or Methodist. They're going to intermarry with descendants of African Americans. They're going to intermarry with the descendants of incorporated indigenous people who also are all going to the same schools because the schools are not segregated. So they're going to the same schools with everybody, just like today. So this is the development process of our culture. Here's another scene. This one is from Congo Town, not in Georgia. Another example of the homes. And as you can see, if you look, this is 1926 Congo Town. Look in the far back, the home's plastered. It looks a little bit more Western. Still a little off. It's not exactly what we do, but it's similar. This one looks a little bit more, Liberian. It doesn't look, So you have a range, a variety. You have diversity, even among the recaptured Africans. I think it's beautiful.
Very. Photograph of Duncan Tapi. of
Is it there
Tapita.
again? Oh, this is just a misplaced. Ignore that.
Because
This
this
is not John King
clarification
copy. This is from. I don't know how that got misplaced. This is the caption for the king with the picture of King Poppy with the leopard. So this does not go with this picture. What I wanted to show you here are the face designs that the people who were on the antelope, all of these recaptured Africans, majority of them coming from that region, practice facial scarification. So that first group, that first generation would have had these scars. They didn't do it to their children because the Liberians didn't allow it. But you can't take it off, it's already done to you, right?
Yeah.
So it was very easy to determine that these were not native or indigenous Liberians, that these were transplants. And the indigenous Liberians, there were a lot of these repatriated Africans settled at, we already know about New Georgia, we know about Congo Town. Marshall was another place that they were settled in great numbers. Edina is another place that were settled in great numbers, and Robertsport, great numbers. So you've got Edina, Marshall, you've got Congo Town, New Georgia, and Robertsport, great numbers, which means they had communities of them living there as opposed to them being integrated. So those areas where they were concentrated, people were afraid of them. In Robertsport, the vibe, people were like, what is this? Because they were different. A little bit of xenophobia, fear.
Mm-hmm.
Why do they look like this? They'd never seen anything like it. They didn't want them there. You had issues in Robertsport where they didn't want them settled. The vibe, people were like, we don't want them here. They started making up, not lies, it's not a good word, making up things though. How they were going to steal their children in the night, and they were, killers, and they were gonna, they were because they belonged to murderous cults, and they sacrificed people's children. These rumors started spreading.
It looks like this clarification did not take root in Liberia because I didn't see it.
They were not allowed to do it to their children. You didn't hear what I said? The first generation of people that came, they were scaring people because
Yeah.
of the scarification, and they did not allow them to pass this ritual practice on to their children. That's my point.
So it just
Okay?
died.
Hmm?
I said, so that just died out.
Right, because it wasn't allowed. So whatever ritual, remember they had to be baptized. They were
Yeah.
Christians now. These are spiritual practices, cultural practices that at the time they felt were in conflict with Christianity. So if you become a Christian, you're not going to do this to your children in the late 19th century.
They are now washed in the blood of Jesus.
Yes, now they're practicing a different ritual. So these, of course, are modern people in these photographs, but I'm just showing you these to show an example of the scarification from that region.
Yeah.
And this was making our populations of people in even Edina, where the Bassa people were, they were like terrified of these people. So they stayed away from Edina. But what ends up happening with this Christian population as they have children, their children don't have scars. Their children now are going to school. They're incorporated. They become very, westernized. And now these places start to thrive. The homes start to improve. You now are educated. You can make better money. You can get a better job. You can participate in government because your education level is. So their children are essentially incorporated fully into the society for the most part. Whereas that first generation was a little frightening.
Yeah.
Now, depending on where they came from, the scars were different. Sometimes the scars were just simple like this. I know that during the Civil War, I had one of my friends tell me they used to call some of the Ecuador guys zipper mouth because some of the guys that came from Nigeria and Benin and places, they had the scars on their
Mm.
face still. So, oh, zipper mouth because of the facial scarification. But this is a ritual practice. We have a form of scarification that's within the poro and sende, but those marks are usually on the chest and the back, not the face. And crowd people sometimes put a little tattoo right here. You know, Grandma Mary Towa used to have the little three marks between her eyes here. Very simple, very beautiful, but
Yeah.
never the kind of mutilation of the face that this new culture was bringing. And remember, they came in great numbers, great numbers. So with time, they were incorporated. One of the things that Roberts used to say is that the indigenous Liberians more easily were more easily absorbed and incorporated than these people coming from the Congo Basin. In many of his writings, he explicitly expressed disdain for this group and was on a mission to get, in his mind, better quality immigrants to come to Liberia, and that they should stop dumping them on Liberians, which was, you know, one of the reasons why he went and met with the Barbados Colonization Society and tried to encourage people from all over the Caribbean. It was Daniel Bashir Warner that did the executive order welcoming everyone from the Caribbean to come back to Liberia. That's when you started getting people from Trinidad and other countries to also join the huge influx of people from Barbados and some Jamaicans as well. So this was it. But that group of recaptured Africans, after a few generations, picks up influence from the crowd speaking people along the coast. They pick up influence from the Bassa. They intermarry with a lot of the indigenous and the descendants of African Americans. They intermarry. They don't do the scarification in Liberia, and they
Yeah.
become kind of a homogenous group of westernized Liberians living in urban centers along the coast, which are descendants of African Americans, recaptured Africans, and indigenous Liberians.
I think I was going to
And
be
we put
looking.
all of them together and call them Congo.
Yeah, I think I was going to be looking cute with that,
No, I don't
scarification.
think so. I don't think so. I don't think so. And you wouldn't scare anybody either. They'll be like, "What happened to you? Did they
No,
stay there?"
it's going to be normal now.
they'll, they'll say, "What happened to you?" Okay, sorrow.
So the repatriated African Americans and Caribbean people played a significant role in shaping Liberia's religion, culture, economy, and language. And I see a picture of a Bible Industrial Mission building in Grand Baza.
Yes. So this next episode next week, we're going to get into this in great depth, and it's a journey of how the history of our collective culture becoming Liberian. It said the first episode we talked about the influence of the crowd group. We talked about the Mendi people, mainly the writing systems, the introduction of Islam, which came before Christianity in the region. Not that Islam is older than Christianity, but it is older to us than Christianity. And then now you have this happening. They're bringing a new writing system. A new writing system. We're now using Roman letters, whereas before we were writing in Arabic. That was a form of literacy. Now in Script. Now we're coming in and we're writing with Roman letters. Now we're worshiping in a different way. And some people who were Muslim before sent their children to the Western school because they wanted them to learn. And they ended up converting. Like in the case of Bishop Gardner, whose parents were Muslim. The case of J.J. Dawson's parents, who became Christian. In the case of so many. So we're going to talk about how that process happened, how people left traditional belief systems and became Christian. But they had already had a history of living traditional belief systems and becoming Muslim. Now there's a shift. Now there's a shift. We're going to talk about that next week.
So you want to join us next week as we talk about that shift?
I just wanted to show Sino because that's where you're from.
So let me show that image good. So that's saying
So
that,
part 3 will be
and
next week.
then we'll go to part 3. But believe me, so good stuff. And I
Yeah.
know you want to join us. You want us to talk a little bit. Please call the number on the screen 605-313-6004. The code is 791-403 #. Morris, I encourage that you call because we're not clear on what you were saying.
I didn't understand what words you saying.
Yeah, he'll call to explain it. You know, Morris is he knows what he's talking about. And you call with questions if you have a comment, or you just call to say, "Oh, Dennis, I like your jacket." Say something. Call us. Or you like the History Channel, that and what you want out of it.
Hmm.
Even if you have suggestions on some topics you're going to treat, call and let's talk as we do this. And call, you may not believe, but somebody has agreed with me here. I think River says pro, like this clarification. You want it to remain. You say that's cool.
This
So
clarification, he says, y'all get up in here, man.
he said, I wish a portion of our population has cars who have been cool.
Yeah,
River
more
says
girlfriends for him
you
when he
can
was
take
in
this
high
car.
school. More girlfriends for him when he was in high school.
Okay.
That's funny.
Lawrence Nyokonjuro say, I hope officials of the Ministry of Education are watching this channel. I hope, they're watching and other Liberians are watching. River says, Pro say, how did the Caribbean shift our religion? What religion they practice? Where are their churches or places of worship?
They were Christians. They were Christians. They were mostly the Protestant, Moravian. They came in. The most important thing that the Caribbean people did, especially the group from Barbados, had a disproportionate number of teachers on that vessel. So when you are being taught in kindergarten through high school by people who have Bayesian accents, you're going to pick up a lot of their twang. So that influence came through education. So many teachers came from Barbados, and before that, of course, you had African American teachers. But so, and the Bayesians were in, they were all around. People always like to say, oh, they were located up the St. Paul River in this one place. That's not necessarily so. They were intermarried and intertwined in the society. They were in Monrovia. They were everywhere. So they had schools everywhere. Um, Many of the women that repatriated to Liberia from the Caribbean and North America were teachers.
Yes.
And schools, I just want to point out, education in those early days was through religious institutions. So the schools were attached to churches. So the reason you saw a lot of people converting to Christianity and leaving the traditions of their parents, whether the parents were African traditionalist or Muslim, is because part of the process of education came with Christian education, with understanding the Bible. And that's why you saw such a high rate of conversion to Christianity, because those teachers were also missionaries. That was their intent.
Say Dunbar say, I would love to support the platform and to encourage similar discussions. My WhatsApp digits are those. So yes, Dunbar, we're going to contact you. I see your call here. Our phone lines are open. There is one call from Liberia. Let me take that one quickly. I think that's Dunbar. Say.
Good morning. It's 2:49 a.m. in Monrovia, Liberia. How are you guys? God bless you guys. I just called to appreciate you people and tell you thank you for the good work.
Thank you.
Hey, Noah, how you
Yeah,
doing?
God bless.
Thank you.
I'm good. Yeah. How you doing, Carl?
I'm good, good. It's good to hear your voice. Long time.
Thank you so much for you.
All right, take care, my brother.
We just need more of this discussion to be translated into the local languages for greater impact. That's all. The ignorance level is too high to risk not getting it into the local languages as well.
Just take on that project for us.
Yeah, we can work on that with you, Dunbar.
Because we need it at the level of the community radio stations where people can hear what you're saying in your native language and be able to relate and learn and grow so that we can actually achieve the level of reconciliation we anticipate for the new Liberia.
I agree with that to some extent. I think simple English would suffice. I don't think there's anybody in that country that doesn't understand simple English.
Right. Yeah, we can take that other step too.
And
I
and,
think.
and Dennis has a PhD in simple English.
All right. Let me bring out. River says, thank you. Thank you. Now, let me bring.
All right, no problem. God bless.
God bless you.
Thank you.
I'll
Thanks
reach
for
out to
calling.
you so we can see how we can collaborate on those efforts. Uh, Abraham Vinton, aka River says Pro, you're live.
Yeah, I mean, don't bother. They are data people, so you don't keep it go too long. But anyway, Dennis, the keep saying my it's stuff not us. I'm a plan. I don't know why he keeps saying every time I call focus on Liberia, they say I will incur extra charges. But
Right.
anyway,
I incur that too. If they charge you, I will cash up you the 20 cents. Go ahead.
yeah, but I got to thank you very much for the show. My professor says sometimes I get annoying, so I'm very afraid to ask questions now. But anyway, I have 2 points. I have 2 questions or comments. So my first one has to do with the she said that the Caribbean influenced our culture, our society. And growing up in the 80s, look, I went to school on Kelly Street, and, my father worked Kerry Street, and the chances of encountering an African American was very higher than encountering a Caribbean. I knew this one man, Mr. Montgomery, and he was married to a Liberian. He had children who worked at the Central Bank and other things. But what happened to them? Did they return? Because in terms of the influence you're talking about, where are the churches in terms of religion or infrastructure? Or there are a lot of Caribbean things, or their accent is distinct. You can tell. We have Fullers right now. That I didn't grow up seeing much of that, so I don't know if they return back to the Barbados or to the Caribbean, or what happened to them, or I want to know. And has to do with
River says, Abraham, huh? Abraham, you know why you talk the way you talk? You talking just one person from Barbados. Go listen to the accent, listen to yourself. You asking where the people went with their accent, you using the vernacular as some of the tonation in pronouncing your words, mixing it with a crowd accent, and then you asking me what happened to them. You're them, So what happens is these people came in the 1800s. You're not going to meet them. They've long passed on with your ancestors. Their descendants are here. That's where you see the Michael Padmores, the Holders, that's who they are. They're not African Americans. They're not African Americans, or they could be, like in Michael Padmore's case, he's a descendant of both repatriated African Americans and Caribbean people. Some people are descendants of Kru people and Caribbean people. Some people are descendants of repatriated African Americans and Mono people. Everybody's mixed up. We marry each other, we have children, generations pass, and we become an ambiguous group, especially in the urban centers.
And from the 19th century, if your descendants start eating togogina now, you still think they will have Barbados accent. You swallow.
But the Barbados accent, y'all talking with it. When people from Barbados, Trinidad, those islands that have that little bit of an Irish influence, when they listen to Liberian English, they understand it. Yeah. You also have influence. You also have influence from Gullah Geechee English, from the swamps of Georgia and South Carolina, right? So you had a lot of Gullah Geechee people repatriate.
So what's your
Like
second
Cubby
point,
Smother.
Riverside Pro? We got more
Okay,
colors
so
here.
my so my second point has to do with the our Scarface group. So okay, since Kowi said that Christianity influenced or impacted the way people went about with the scar because they don't want to see the Christian came in, they don't want to put on the children. But I know I want people to. I mean, there are people who go on to tradition. They are tough people. And when you go in Nigeria today, despite of Christianity, despite of the British influence, they still wear their scarf. So why our people got? Sorry, I don't want to use the word punk, but they got punk out of their own culture, their own deity. I mean, their own, and they allow the white man to say, "Oh, don't draw stuff on your children's face." Whereby people in Benin and other African countries, they proudly still wear that scarf. I would love to see some people with scarf in Liberia. I mean, why? I mean, why they allow the
Yeah, Abraham, I've traveled all over West Africa. Most people have abandoned those practices, except you come from really extreme rural areas in Nigeria and Benin. But most people have abandoned those practices. Most West Africans are either Muslim or Christian. And most West Africans have abandoned African traditional religions. This is a fact. So I don't know why you're looking at Liberia like it's an anomaly. If you go to Ivory Coast and you start talking about traditional African religion, they're going to look at you like you're insane. Because most West Africans today are either Muslim or Christian. And so it doesn't mean that there are not pockets of people who practice traditional religions or try to incorporate them or intertwine them with Christianity, but it is not as common. Today, most Africans pray to the gods of the people who conquered them. That is a fact.
Okay.
Right. And all right. Thank you. Let me bring in Aliyu Kamara. Aliyu Valley,
Yes.
Go ahead. You're live.
Yeah, well, you organize. I just hope people on the line. When I call, when you finish, let go. Okay, this is nice. But anyway, great. I just wanted to tell Paul, if you want spinach in Liberia, have a water green. They call it water green. So you not say water green.
No, water green different from spinach, but it's close.
Water green. We can eat water green a lot in Liberia. That's spinach.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wanted to agree with her with the animal thing, the leper society. Now, what I didn't know was that it could have been imported. But the leper society is a big society in Pong County. I particularly remember a guy named Joe Thomas. It's a guy named Joe B. Thomas, who they say he was a part of that society. And we attended the same mission school in Salala. And there were days that this guy would wake up and call. You can see the man's face and his body. You can see those deep wounds, scratches go all the way inside his flesh. And he would get sick for weeks and he would not go to school. But the principal and everybody in the school actually knew what society he was a part of. So overnight they used to have argument and have fight, leper fight and stuff, according to him. I used to be very argumentative. I used to want to debate it. But with my bare eye, the kind of things I saw, like real animal claw going into the man's body, and we all sleep, on the mission school, the boys are just cut in wild dormitories. So we all sleeping together. So if this guy was in a fight with something other than a human being, we would know. And a human being would not damage your body like that. You can actually see the marks of the claw on this guy. I'm not saying I believe it, but I don't doubt it. But I'm just saying, yeah, she's right there. There is level stuff, and it has some spiritual thing. I believe so. I saw the evidences of it. So those are just the two reasons I actually called. But very sure.
So Ali, you went to mission school too?
Yeah, I went to sleep mission.
Jesus Christ. Anyway.
That's where I got my troubles. That's where I got my highness from. The man that you gotta boss it.
Thank you, Aliyu. Let me bring up Augustine Todi.
Yeah, good evening.
Good evening, Augustine.
Yeah. My question, I think, is similar to what that guy was saying that I did not understand. Those people from the Caribbean, we want to make sure, we're thinking, whether it's really all those that they took to Liberia, are they the African or some Caribbean citizens or some Caribbean that were somehow pulled in a way or felt that these people were going away, so they were going to a good place that joined them? Or all those that took back for the Caribbean, Jamaica, all the places, all that.
Can I ask you a question?
I didn't understand the question. In fact.
Let me ask him a question for clarification.
The question is.
Let me ask you a question for clarification, please, because I'm lost. You're asking me if there were actually Caribbean people, as in Caribbean Indians, like indigenous Caribbean people, or Europeans, or Asians? I mean, what are you saying?
So my question is that whether all the people they took from the Caribbean, whether they are African, they were Africans, or they were people that were Caribbean themselves that did not come from Africa that they took alone.
And when you say when they are Caribbean,
okay, now I understand his question.
Talk about
so what the question, the issue with the question, so the issue with the question is a misunderstanding of Caribbean history. The first thing is, indigenous people in the Caribbean islands, many of those Caribbean islands were victims of genocide. Most, not all. And their populations were replaced with enslaved Africans who were brought mainly to plant sugar and other things. And those Africans were interacted. There were also a lot of Irish people that were introduced, some people from India, which is in Asia, and then later on some Chinese migrants. At the time when the people from Barbados went to Liberia, they were Afro-Barbadians, meaning they were descendants of enslaved African people. We have two presidents who were descendants of Bajans. The first, Arthur Barclay, his grandparents were born, all four of his grandparents, and I believe his father, no, I'm sorry, not his father, his grandparents were born in Dahomey. They were Dahomians, or from Benin. And so they knew they were from Benin because he's just a generation removed from Benin. They were going to Africa to start a home. So it's important to understand that we're not talking about pulling, indigenous Native Americans who, look similar to the people in Mexico, the indigenous Mexicans, they're not African people. They don't look like us. Arthur Barclay could have put on a Mandinka gown and looked like he was from Bopru. So this is not a question of their identity. They knew who they were.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And I also want to point one thing out, my dear. The Constitution of Liberia was set up as an asylum for the descendants of African people. So they did not reach out to people who are not Africans and tell them to come to repatriate to Liberia. So it should, that's why I was confused by what Morris was saying. I hope he can call and clarify, but there was no, you cannot be a non-African and be citizen. The Negro clause was built into the Constitution. So where's the idea that there's non-Africans immigrating to Liberia? That didn't happen.
Thank you. Well, those are all the colors we have. Next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Do you have any other questions?
Yeah, thank you. Next week, we're going to be doing part 3, the history of our culture, part 3. Let's wrap it up. Your closing.
Yeah. So part 3, we are going to look at the influence of Christianity. So we're going to look at the repatriated African Americans in more detail. We're going to look at the Caribbean repatriates in more detail. But the big focus, the main focus next week is going to be on, on the schools. The main focus next week is going to be on the schools that were built and how the education process shifted the culture and the religion of the majority of the population. How did the majority of Liberians become Christian? How did they become baptized and Christianized? How did they come to adapt Christianity and Western ideas? And then we're going to end that with latter years, like our parents' generation, maybe for some of us, our grandparents' generation, depending on your age. How did they then balance learning religion and culture and English and still remaining native? Because that in the early years, that didn't really happen much. We have a Bassa man who becomes president. Everybody thinks he's a Congo man, Daniel Edward Howard, because the idea was you just become Liberian, you become a homogenous cultural entity. But there's much more emphasis on tribalism in modern Liberia than there was 100 years ago. We are far more tribalistic today than we were 100 years ago. Ethnicity in our region has always been fluid. The fluidity of ethnicity, meaning people married, people interacted, people spoke multiple languages. Everyone was not the same thing that they were from birth. So you had Vai people speaking Maninka, you had Maninka speaking people that could speak Bandi, that could speak Pele. And these cultures, these languages were intertwined in ways that sometimes people would be indistinguishable from one another because they could speak each other's languages. Daniel Edward Howard spoke Bassa, Grable, and Krau. How many living Bassa people are able to speak those other dialects? It was normal in those days to speak more than one language. It was normal for a Pella woman to be able to also speak Mano and Loma. How many of us can do that today? So the way that we think, the way we look at the world, the way we see ourselves is not the way our great-great-grandparents saw themselves and one another. There was much more interaction, and the line between ethnic groups was blurred in ways that it no longer, for some reason, we got to a point where we're trying to separate ourselves. But the entire theme of this process, this conversation, is not only that ethnicity is fluid, it's fluid because we are more alike than unalike. Why were Congos able to just come and eventually after 1-2 generations just become? It's because we are more similar than dissimilar. So please join us next week. It's going to be interesting. And if you didn't watch the first one, go back and watch it. Go back and watch it. It's a process. How did our culture develop to what it is, which is very unique and distinct in Africa?
So join us next week, same time as Saturday, same time for the history of our culture, part 3. Until then, we end with our song that says, whether you came from the Barbados or you came from the Congo Basin, or you were there, or from Georgia, we are all Liberians. Have a good night and God bless you.
We are Liberians. Liberia is our home.